picking up on page 40, we'll go from page 40 to 46, where we talk about studying the language of second language learners. And again, we're trying to develop textbooks, we're trying to develop curriculum that kind of is similar to sort of a natural order of learning language. And as I said before, instead of just thinking like simple to complex, in fact, frequency, as far as vocabulary, frequency is very important. That means that we may have to learn some difficult words early on because they're so frequent, even though they're not a very simple word, like vacation, or middle name, or like some words that you might need early on, or how long have you been here? How long have you been in this country? Like a fairly complex grammatical sentence, but you might need that, the first day you get here, for example. And so as the learner learns English, they have this language in development called learner language, and they're making certain types of mistakes, and we try to find out what types of mistakes they make. It's kind of frustrating as a teacher of ESL, because sometimes we can correct a student or we can teach a student, but it doesn't mean they'll necessarily be able to apply that, even if they understand it. So even if you correct a student and show them the correct way, once they start talking and communicating and getting real practice, they might keep falling back on that same mistake. And that's just because they haven't really internalized it subconsciously yet. But that's okay. That's natural. We still teach it. We still correct them. And if we give students a lot of communicative practice, honestly, we can't stop them a lot. A lot of times a student will say to me, "Please tell me every time I make a mistake, and please interrupt me." And it's impossible to keep the conversation going if we do that. So I'll take notes sometimes. Like if I'm one-on-one, I'll take notes of the errors the student's making. So after we finish talking, I can go over them. But again, even if I go over them, it doesn't mean that the student will necessarily acquire them. So really it's just more practice, more communication that over time is really going to kind of fix the problems. And that's why it's kind of hard to measure success in language learning in terms of what's working and what's not working. Which makes it hard because people have different ideas about the best way to learn a foreign language, and there's a lot of argument about it. Some people really like the traditional ways, like repeat after me and memorizing dialogues and studying grammar, really understanding grammar and analyzing pronunciation. And when you try sort of a more modern method of just pair work, group work, talk to your partner, do this task together, sometimes the students feel they're not really learning as much, even though they might be. That's one of the reasons to really study and do research on theories of second language acquisition, so that you can defend yourself when students or parents feel like, oh, this game won't help us, or singing this song won't help us, we just want to study grammar, or we have to get a high score on this international English exam, or we have to get into college, we can't just have fun in the class, things like that. So we kind of have to know what we're doing. And sometimes if a student memorizes some phrases or chunk learning, then it can kind of disguise or hide their weakness that they have. But once they start having to produce their own sentences, then the errors come out. So making errors, well, that's good because it's natural, and also it shows us as a teacher, what's going on in their head and what types of mistakes they're making. The audiolingual method, ALM, in the 50s and 60s, tried to have a language learning method without any errors. Everything was controlled. Say this sentence, put this subject together with this verb, change the singular to plural, repeat after me. because they felt that that they don't want to make bad habits. That's more of a behaviorism type of approach to learning, behavioristic. And that's what was so criticized by Noam Chomsky in the late 50s and 60s, because he felt that language production, even for children, they're not just repeating and practicing. They're constantly producing their own sentences, even from a really young age. And so we need to give students a chance to produce their own sentences as much as possible. The contrastive analysis hypothesis is just the idea of if you compare two languages, like your first language with English, then they believe that all of your mistakes that you make when you learn a second language are because it's different than your first language. So if we could just compare all the grammatical structures, compare all the words, compare the pronunciation, we can sort of scientifically learn this language. But what we find is that it's not really that simple. And it's almost like a translation type of thinking, that if we can just learn to translate everything from one language to the other, then we'll have it. But that doesn't really take into consideration that the new language has a whole new way of putting words together and putting ideas together. For example, like Japanese students, in Japanese, they have subject, object, verb. So in English, if we say like, I wash the car, they would say, I the car wash. But I can tell you, I've almost never had a student from Japan say, I the car wash. It's like they don't necessarily make that type of mistake. In fact, what's interesting is that students from all different countries, they tend to have similar problems and make similar mistakes in the ESL classroom, which is really a good argument for the idea that when you learn a new language, you kind of take it as it is, and you learn this new system. And there's not as much interference as you might think. You're expecting everything to be interference. Pronunciation is kind of an exception. Like, when I make a pronunciation mistake, you can usually identify that as, what country I'm from. And that means that, yes, I am trying to speak English using my first language's pronunciation. So pronunciation tends to have a lot of interlingual influence and errors in this case, but not necessarily with words and grammar. Especially like the more natural way you learn, again, just kind of immersing yourself into this new language. Like in Spanish, well, in English we say, I love you. And in Spanish, it's like, yo te amo. But I've never heard a Spanish speaker say, I, you love. I, you love. It's like that error doesn't necessarily transfer across. And there's something called plateauing. Plateauing is when you're learning a foreign language, you don't necessarily improve in a slow angle. You improve very quickly, then you plateau. And some people even say you can get worse in a language, like if you're tired or you're burned out or something, and then you can go up again. So language learning tends to be up and down and plateauing. Another interesting thing is some people, like you study foreign language, and then if you give it a break for a while, or you go back home to your original country, sometimes when you come back into the language again, you've actually improved just over time without even working on it that much. It's almost like your brain was still working on it or absorbing things, in that process. Other things like negation, in English is kind of tricky, like we have no and we have not and don't and can't. So, every language has such a different way of doing negation, and also question formation. English is pretty tricky the way we invert the subject and verb. So learning to create questions in English is pretty complex, but we'll talk more about that later.